Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the series of things that may blow your mind if you're not into academic biblical studies or Semitics, but which are actually quite banal if you are, featuring yours truly, Ola Wikander, your friendly neighborhood Ugaritologist. And today I shall be talking about Deutero-Isaiah. And who was Deutero-Isaiah? Well, some of you may know. Deutero-Isaiah is the name normally given to chapters 40 through 55 in the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible book of Isaiah. The book of Isaiah is vast. There's a lot of stuff in that prophetic book. The quote-unquote conservative view, which you do not find in critical scholarship, academic scholarship normally, but in more conservative confessional views, is the idea that the entirety of this book, the entirety of the book we call Isaiah, goes back to a man called Isaiah, or well, rather, he would have been called Yeshayahu, Adonai, the Lord saves. That was his name in Hebrew. And the whole book is supposed to go back to him, a man who was allegedly active in the second half of the 8th century BCE in Jerusalem. The problem is, and this was noticed already in the 1800s by academic biblical scholarship, the problem is that much of the stuff in this book just doesn't fit that context at all. There's a big chunk in the middle of it, well, mid-end, chapters 40 to 55, which seems to presuppose a totally different context. Here, the context is not the struggles of Judea in the 8th century, conflicts with Assyria and Aram Damascus, stuff that takes up a huge part of the first section of the book. The problems here in the second part are totally different. They seem to have to do with the end of the Babylonian exile, which took place in the 6th century BCE, so 200 years later. And that's weird. That's weird. And the switch comes very suddenly. If you look through a modern biblical translation, you can see this. And at the start of chapter 40, something very new happens. It goes into sort of a consolation mode. Nahamu, nahamu, ami, yomar Elohechem. Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. And then the text goes on talking about the imminent return of the Judean exiles in Babylonia through the desert, going west to the homeland. And this is something that just doesn't fit with what has come before very well. And this is one of the reasons, one of the main reasons why academic scholarship has determined that this middle part, chapters 40 to 55, are a separate block of the book that was written quite a bit after some of the earlier parts. It was probably written in the 6th century and reflected the imminent end of the Babylonian exile. It talks a lot about Cyrus, Koresh, the Kurush, however you want to call him, the Persian king who subsequently crushed, or rather took over, the Neo-Babylonian Empire and ended it and turned it into the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Then, of course, there are more chapters than that, 56 through 66, which form sort of a weird block unto themselves. And in scholarship, it's common to call the first block, chapter 1 to 39, Proto-Isaiah, the first Isaiah, and then call chapters 40 through 55, the ones we're talking about here, call that Deutero-Isaiah, the second Isaiah, and the rest Trito-Isaiah, the third Isaiah. When this theory was born, it was common to regard these as three people. Isaiah number 1, Isaiah number 2, and Isaiah number 3. Nowadays, most scholars agree that it's much more complicated than that, and that many more people were probably involved than just three guys, because, you know, they probably were guys given the gender norms of the time, even though we can't be sure. There have been suggestions that Deutero-Isaiah was actually a woman, so guys in the extended sense of the word. But today, most scholars would say that these are three blocks, but they don't necessarily reflect three people. The first one specifically is made up of material from lots of different time periods. Chapter 1, for example, is often regarded as being possibly the latest part of the book of all, which was added as a sort of foreword at the end of the redactional process. But we're talking here about Deutero-Isaiah specifically. That is the block that is made up of chapters 40 through 55, which deal mostly with the Babylonian exile and the end thereof, and the liberation, or probably coming liberation, of the Judahite people. Well, those of the Judahite people who didn't choose to stay in Babylon, because many did. The liberation from Babylonian captivity, which subsequently took place in 538 BCE, when Cyrus allowed the exiled to return home if they so wished. What I want to talk about specifically here is not the fact that basically all scholars agree that Deutero-Isaiah is something different than Proto-Isaiah and something different than the third Isaiah as well. What I want to take up here as a point of discussion is some of the pushback you sometimes get when you talk about this with people from, say, an evangelical background or just a conservative Christian background, or any other conservative religious background which doesn't accept the splitting of the book into at least three parts, probably more than that. And the argument you often hear from those circles when you talk about this is, well, Isaiah was a prophet. Couldn't he just have foreseen the Babylonian exile and foreseen the end thereof? Case closed. You don't have to split it up at all. Okay, two issues here. The first one is, of course, that critical biblical scholarship is not really allowed to take that sort of supernatural activity into account. But let's ignore that for a moment. Let's grant, for the sake of argument, that yes, first Isaiah, the Isaiah of Jerusalem in the 8th century BCE, was in fact able to see into the future and see what would happen in the 6th century. Let's just grant that. And just for the sake of argument, not care about demarcations of scholarship and science. There's a much bigger problem at work, namely that if you take that stance, that what we find in Deutero-Isaiah is in fact the words of the first Isaiah, then that guy, the first Isaiah, would have made no sense to his audience. None. The quote-unquote prophecies, well, they are prophecies in the sense of the biblical genre prophecy. The prophecies about ending the exile in Babylon would have made zero sense to the people in Jerusalem in the 8th century. None. It would have been ramblings. All this talk about Cyrus, Koresh, or Kurush. Nobody in the 8th century in Jerusalem knew who that was, because he hadn't been born yet and wouldn't be for quite some time. Nobody knew about the dominance of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, because the power they had to contend with, the great power they had to contend with in the 8th century, was not Babylonia but Assyria. The whole discussion would have been totally irrelevant to them. The whole idea that they would have to go west, as it were, through the desert, which is what you see discussed already in chapter 40, would have made no sense. Through the desert? There was no desert to cross to get home in 8th century Judah, because they were already in their home. They didn't need to go home through any desert. This means that if you want to defend the unity of the book of Isaiah as being written by one guy, all in the 8th century BCE, you're actually doing harm to the credibility of the book's contents. And I mean credibility not in a necessarily historical or much less religious sense. I mean credibility in the sense of having it make any sense to its audience. It would have been inscrutable what this guy was talking about. And even more so for the third part, by the way, which presupposes an entirely different situation after the exile ended. So if you attack the scholarly understanding of the division of the book of Isaiah, you're not only attacking the ideas underlying critical biblical scholarship, you're basically making the book make much less sense. You're presupposing that the historical Isaiah of the 8th century would have been talking nonsense to his audience. And I ask you, which is the easier to presuppose? That your cherished prophet was talking nonsense, or that the book is actually written not in one chunk but in several, which was a process that went on for probably hundreds of years, which is fascinating. And to finish up, I want to give you a little tip for a book you could read on how Isaiah of Jerusalem came to be regarded as the author. And that's my colleague David Davidge, who's written a very nice book about possible ways in which this attribution may have appeared in ancient times, called How Isaiah Became an Author. So I recommend that for reading. So yeah, Isaiah makes much more sense cut up into chunks than the book does read as a big, big, big block. And remember, as always, that the texts that we refer to as the Bible read best in their original languages.